Hi, I'm Richard Armstrong. I'm from the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and the Honors College. And I work in what is in English called the field of classical studies. But today I wanted to talk about culture in the long view, which is to say the way we who are interested in ancient studies generally look at culture and how that differs from people in anthropology and other fields, but also what are some of the areas in which historically we've had contact. What's interesting about this is, in a lot of ways, classical studies, when you think about it, is at the very center of the history of the Western university. We're sort of the classic dead white male department, since so many of the texts and things that we deal with have been very influential in Western culture, in good ways and bad ways. But one of the things that I want to stress today is not only is this field still very much alive, but it continues to evolve. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that historically it's often provided not simply, you might say, ideological reinforcement, but a critical perspective on culture. And that is something that is continuing to happen. So what I thought I would do is to discuss this, first of all, in terms of the general organization of the field and things that are happening today. My area specifically is actually called reception studies, and what that means is how it is that the culture of antiquity is used in modern times, or by modern we might mean going all the way back to the Middle Ages and Renaissance. So my modernity is very broad. That's sort of my agenda. So I can get this to work. Let's just talk a moment about the traditional disciplines of this field, and again, I'll talk a little bit about how they've been influential in the study of culture generally, but how each discipline has added a new critical component to the study of culture. And so what we'll talk about is archaeology, which is something may have been addressed already in this series, philology, and I'll explain what that is later, history, and then my own field, which is new, and that is reception studies. Now, when we talk about archaeology, this is perhaps one of the most dramatic and interesting things for anyone in terms of the general public. The reason is, of course, we have objects and places emerging literally out of the ground, giving us a sense of real presence of the ancient world. And there's sort of four basic concepts of archaeology that have been very influential, especially since the 19th century in the study of culture. First of all, there's the inherent romance of discovery. One of the things that's interesting about archaeology is it goes well beyond what we thought we knew of the past. We discover through sites that were, heretofore unknown, things that we may have no written record or reference to. Whole civilizations might emerge. And that's important because one of the things that's interesting about the modern study of the ancient world is what we might call the newness of the past. That is to say, the antiquity we have today is not the same as the antiquity of the 19th century or the 18th century. We have so much more information that emerges from the earth as people continue to excavate. And this, again, transforms a lot of what we thought we knew. And so there's a paradox, the idea that there can be a newness to the past. But this has been a reality, and it continues to grow. In other words, there's really not a point at this point where anyone would feel like they could say, yeah, we have all the information we're going to get, because we continue to get new information. So the simple fact of discovery is one of the things that always makes archaeology dramatic. Things that were never mentioned in any previous text might simply emerge as, some kind of subway is being dug, or as, some Bedouin boy goes wandering through a cave in the Middle East. And so again, I think there's a very good reason why, if you look at the Discovery Channel or what popular books are being sold, archaeology tends to be something that everyone knows something about and finds a certain fascination with. Now, excavation is obviously the process of archaeological recovery, of working on sites. If you read any accounts of the 19th century when this really began to be done in earnest, what you realize is it took some time for these techniques to be developed so that they weren't actually destructive techniques. Originally, there was a lot of interest in digging for treasures effectively, something that was not quite tomb robbing, but in a way, really, if you go back to the Renaissance in Italy, for example, when a lot of excavation first began, It was looking for treasures like statues and things like that, what we often think of as antiquarianism. And it took some time for a kind of more methodologically sound form of excavation to occur. But excavation also became a very important metaphor, a painstaking way in which one lays out a site and trying to, not disturb it, slowly pick through it. And to give you an idea of the impact of the very idea of excavation, when the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, was first working on his clinical technique, especially for dream interpretation and free association, he began to liken it to archaeological excavation, that one's sort of relationship to oneself could become, in fact, archaeological. And part of that idea is that you cannot assume you know what you're digging for, right? That you must be methodologically prepared for the sheer surprise, and therefore you must have a discipline not to just plow through things and looking for something that you think you're going to find, when in fact you may find many things that are unexpected. Okay? Now, one of the more difficult parts of archaeology is the idea of reconstruction. What do you do with artifacts? Obviously, if you've ever seen pots that have been glued back together, if you have pieces that look like they belong together, there's a very strong need to put them back together. However, it's really kind of an enduring frustration that an awful lot that comes through is in fact fragmentary. So this is where we find, beginning again well before the 19th century, this problem of understanding what the status of this artifact is. Is it a fragment? Do we have the right to reconstitute it? Is it a work of art? Is it a masterpiece that ought to be restored? When one takes guesses at that kind of reconstruction, do you in fact destroy the artifact, right? There's a lot that goes into this process today, and you'll see in museums things are done in different ways. But it's interesting, and later when we look at some poetry, what you'll find is a certain fascination again with the endurance of these objects, and sometimes it's their very fragmentary nature that kind of stimulates the modern mind when they look at it. Again, just to draw another reference to how the very idea of reconstruction can be important beyond the field of ancient studies, Sigmund Freud himself thought that as he was trying to reconstitute the past through this archaeology of the self, he was doing reconstructions himself that were valid in the same way that archaeological reconstructions are valid. So again, these ideas in the study of culture or the study of the self have a certain power that goes well beyond simply the field of ancient studies. Now, lastly, another important area that really is between archaeology and philology is what we call epigraphy and decipherment, and that is a lot of ancient sites will yield texts, sometimes on stone, sometimes on more conventional writing materials, kind of an early form of parchment or paper. And again, what's interesting there is archaeology in the 19th century, and especially in the 20th century, recovered all kinds of texts that were an utter surprise. Again, to this day, we no longer think we have all of the texts of antiquity. We realize that we may discover many things yet that will surprise us. And I just want you to kind of keep in mind then that because archaeology made such a powerful impact since the 19th century in how we look at the past, this radical newness of the past is something that we now live with. It is something that we assume may continue to surprise us. Now, in this set of pictures, I just wanted to put together a series of things to kind of help you understand the cultural impact of archaeology and how it changes our sort of modern view of ancient culture. Up here in the upper left-hand corner, we have a painting by Gustav Klimt, the famous Austrian painter, which is a figure of archaeology, a sort of muse, if you will. And what's interesting about that is this is from the Great Art Historical Museum in Vienna. Something to keep in mind is, simultaneous with the actual excavation and discovery of things in the 19th century, there was a growth of European nationalism, a growth of the sense that the state should invest in cultural institutions, and this is tied with the growth of the idea of the museum, where there is a kind of national patrimony that's going to be put on display for the education of the public. this means, again, that we move out of the realm of mere antiquarianism where you have, aristocrats and gentlemen scholars interested in these things, to the idea that the past is a public possession. To this day, if you go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, on the ground floor there in the Newbeck building, what will you find? Ancient artifacts, right? The sense that you are entitled to see this, you have access to this, and it is literally on the ground floor, you might say, of the history of humanity's art. This is a very important idea, how culturally we begin to stage what we call the archive of antiquity, or stage these artifacts in such a way that they begin to fulfill a public function. The study of the museums is one of the most fascinating things you can get into, and I would certainly encourage you, if you are interested, to consider even pursuing a career in there, because there's a lot of public interface that constantly needs people who are getting degrees in ancient studies, anthropology, etc. So over here in the upper right-hand corner, well, I guess that's my right, what you see is an early staging of recent artifacts that the Austrians had excavated in Ephesus, in what is today Turkey. And what you find there is you can see how they are staged as really objects of art almost, on pedestals, okay? One of the interesting things is you can see how museums change as our views and interests of culture change. Originally, a lot of what was recovered was thought of as masterpieces of art, and therefore, they look a lot like Renaissance, statues, which were in part an imitation of antiquity in the way that they're staged, the niches that they're put into, etc. In fact, this initial excavation, these finds rather, were put on display in an exact replica of the Temple of Theseus in Athens, which they built in a park in Vienna. What has happened today is more and more, if you go to the great museums like the British Museum and Museum of Fine Arts in the Metropolitan Museum, rather, in New York, you'll find that modern museum curators like to find other ways to get people interested in these artifacts, not simply as masterpieces, but also in terms of social history, material culture, etc. But it still is very much a part, if you will, of the rhetoric of the museum, that you are to go and confront a great masterpiece of the ancient world and feel moved and overwhelmed in some sense. And we'll look at some kind of poetic reflections on that at the end of today's lecture. Now, over in the lower corner here, my left-hand corner, what you see is something that comes from a publication of Heinrich Schliemann's excavations on the site of Troy. This is just a little visual reminder of how much archaeological discovery can captivate the imagination. Schliemann was a businessman. He became a millionaire and invested a lot of his money in pursuing a childhood dream, or so he said, which was to try and find out if the myths of Homer had any basis in fact. And so by finding what he thought is the site of Homeric Troy and investigating, digging up, actually he kind of ripped up the site fairly badly, what he felt he had done was to prove the facts behind the story. Said that this is not simply a fable, a past that never was, but rather something with a basis in reality. I find that interesting, in part because if you are of a poetic temperament, you might find that's a very strange thing to do. But at the same time, it sort of shows this modern desire to kind of get to some factual root of something through the investigation of material culture. Just to give you an idea of the impact of Schliemann's discovery, what he effectively did was to begin an excavation of Greek prehistory, the Mycenaean and Minoan ages of Greece. These were unknown, or at least not understood as being distinct and different from classical civilization, because they came from a time before our classical sources, were basically doing any kind of record. And what's interesting about that is it created a certain romance of the idea of prehistory. Now, you might know this already from 19th century, discoveries in paleontology, for example, or the study of early hominids. But prehistory is a powerful concept. What it means is that the official history, the written history, does not tell all. And again, it is archaeology very often that will discover something that is beyond, or you might say beyond the radar of traditional views of the past. So Heinrich Schliemann then is a very kind of key character in that regard. And to go back to my constant sort of comparison here, Sigmund Freud thought of himself as the Schliemann of the mind. He thought that what he was doing was an attempt to find something about individual prehistory through psychoanalysis, through especially the investigation of childhood. And I want you to kind of hold on to that idea because it's a very powerful one in European thought. That is, that the ancient world is the childhood of humanity. In the 19th century and into the 20th, this is kind of a truism, and one that still, to a certain degree, people hold on to. Lastly, over in the lower right-hand corner, you see Howard Carter dusting this exquisite sarcophagus of King Tut. This is something that happened in the 1920s. The discovery of the King Tutankhamun's grave, as I'm sure you know, is one of the greatest triumphs of modern archaeology. And recently, I hope some of you at least were able to actually go to the King Tut exhibit here at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. A wonderful exhibit. That is a great example of how much the confrontation with the reality of the ancient world can boggle our minds. If you look at the exquisite workmanship and the complexity, as well as simply what we might call the thought world behind the way in which that young pharaoh was buried, we find things that really challenge any notion we might have that antiquity must, in a sense, be primitive. Because the material complexity of the artifacts is admirable, but also the conceptual richness and complexity of that world is quite admirable. So, that's just a view of the importance of archaeology. I'm not an archaeologist, but like most people who work in this field, I have to be quite aware of archaeology because there's so much so many ways in which this has had an impact. Now let's talk about philology. Philology is essentially the archaeology of texts. Just as you recover, artifacts from antiquity, we have a great many texts, and some of the traditional subdisciplines, you might say, of philology generally are textual criticism and publication. That's one of the most important. And this is where basically you take whatever existing copies of an ancient text there are, and we'll talk about that in a second, but they are largely in manuscript form, and you compare them, you try to see, to establish a text, that is, put together the best text you can, and most importantly, ever since the Renaissance, you publish it. That is, in modern printed form, and increasingly, obviously, on the internet, you try to make it available. One of the important things about the Renaissance and Reformation period is precisely making available texts like Aristotle and Plato and the Greek text of the New Testament, the Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible, so that there is a greater number of people that have access to them. We are living in a time now when there's a so-called digital renaissance, when this is going on an even greater front because of what the internet has made possible. Now, why would that be important? It's important because that means more people are able to look at and determine what the texts say and what they don't say, and they're also able to make a better judgment about how they ought to be reconstituted. And I don't want to get too far into this, but you have to understand there is a lot of complexity in the way you do this. For example, you take a text by an ancient tragedian, a tragedy, right? And you might say that there are lots of lines here that seem a bit out of place, and then you look at the meter of them and you realize, no, this really doesn't fit with the rest of it. And you begin to think, well, these might have been put there by actors, right, who were trying to pad out the scene. This is a common problem, actually, in the editing of dramatic texts. It's a problem that in Shakespeare studies they have to deal with. So then you have to decide, well, what's the real text? Now, the kernel of that critical method of trying to say what is the original text, this creates what you might say the critical element of philology that's been very important in the study of culture. Essentially a suspicion about texts. And when something like this is deployed on the Bible, you can imagine it might have a sort of significant impact on how you see the truth of the Bible. Traditionally, for example, the Torah is thought to be the work of Moses, right? But when you begin to analyze the first 5 books of the Bible and realize this is a composite text, there are actually different versions that are sort of sutured together in the book of Genesis, then this begins to sort of cast in a different light whatever the authority of this text is. So ever since the Renaissance, when philology was a great and important undertaking, that critical aspect towards the text has been very important in the study of culture, especially with authoritative texts. Now, in terms of lexicography, this is simply dictionaries. Why is that important? Well, obviously, if you're dealing with ancient languages like Egyptian or Hittite or Akkadian, that is a very difficult task. How do you even begin to write a dictionary for a dead language that hasn't been spoken in many years? But also the very idea of the dictionary. When you think about it, you take that quite for granted. Again, this is something that has grown out of the need to create dictionaries and modern equivalences for words in ancient tongues. So we take it quite for granted that there is such a thing as a dictionary, but it grows again from this very ancient practice of a need to make ancient texts understood. In fact, this really begins in antiquity. Along with that comes historical linguistics, which has been very important in understanding things that we couldn't otherwise understand. What kind of groups in the world are related? Well, one way for groups to be related, besides, things that can be determined through material culture and DNA, is language. So you may know, for example, that the English language is part of a greater family of Indo-European languages, right? There's been a long history of the comparative study of languages and the writing of their relative histories, again, in part beginning in classical studies, but moving far beyond. And that shows interesting affinities. In the 18th century, for example, when it was discovered that Sanskrit was related to Latin and Greek, this changed a lot, for certain people at least, of their attitude towards what is the relationship between Indian civilization and Western civilization. So again, that was, you might say, a radical redrawing of lines that people thought might have been drawn differently on the basis of history and culture. Literary history and criticism has always been a part of this as well, because besides the sort of textual discipline of establishing a text, there's the question of what is its importance? What are the values of this text? And what kind of evolution is there that is available, that you can discern through texts? And again, as older professors in literature departments might remember, philology used to be the heart of literary study, and the modern growth of modern language departments was often based or used tools that had been kind of perfected in the study of ancient civilizations and classical civilizations. So, for example, in the study of the English language, it's typical for you to study Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Saxon literature as, in some sense, important or even foundational to the story of English culture. That's kind of an interesting and problematic assumption. But again, part of that interest comes from the notion that languages have a history, and this history and its development are terribly important. And lastly, we come to translation. This has become more and more one of the most significant areas of study, and it's strongly related to reception study. And the reason why is most people today will encounter an ancient text, if they do at all, in translation. We work in both biblical studies and classical studies with some of the most translated literature in the world. And for that reason, in the growth of modern translation studies, the kind of work that one can do with classical texts in simply the history of translation, the many, literally hundreds of translations of Homer into English, for example, has been very important. Now, just going back to archaeology, there have been many dramatic recoveries of texts that are part of the archaeological scenario that, again, transform what we know. What you see on the left here, the Rosetta Stone, this is a classic sort of inscription, but what is interesting about that is this was absolutely key to the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's in 3 languages, well, 2 languages, and you might say 2, or I guess you could say 3 languages. Hieroglyphic script and the language that is there, the Demotic script, which is a later form of Egyptian, whether you consider that different or not, this is how we're counting the languages, and Greek. This comes from a time when Egypt had been a part of the Greek Macedonian Empire, and therefore Greek was an official administrative language. On the basis of that, they were able to actually decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics, which opened up, again, a whole new world. On the right, you see the Dead Sea Scrolls. You may have heard something about them. This was another great element of happenstance. Again, classic story of a Bedouin boy throwing a rock into a cave, and he hears this sound, and it turns out there's some pots in there full of texts. These texts have been very, very important in allowing us to understand better the world of what we call Second Temple Judaism. And they have been very influential in Jewish studies and biblical studies generally. However, most philology is based upon well-known medieval manuscripts that are copies made centuries and centuries after their original. And so what you see here is an ancient, well, it's a, 11th century AD manuscript of Homer. So when you consider that the Homeric texts are coming about, anywhere from, the 5th century on BC, this is a very late text, okay? And yet, these are the texts that survive. So most modern editions of works survive because of texts like this. And what you see is not simply down here at the beginning, this is the beginning of Book 10 of the Iliad, but around it, all sorts of commentary. This is what most people have to deal with. The commentary can date from the ancient world, and it can be continued as a sort of tradition. And what I like about this is it's kind of an image of the idea of tradition, which we're going to get back to. You have a text which is, kind of like this sacred object at the center, and then you have all this commentary around it, which represents an interaction with the text. However, again, archaeology allows us to recover more than, inscriptions on stone, but also papyrus, especially in places like Egypt, which are dry and which allow for this kind of reed paper to survive. And again, these represent some dramatic recoveries. For example, the comic poet Menander we knew by reputation largely. At antiquity, he was tremendously important for the genre. And what you see here is a pretty wretched fragment, right? As you can see, it's not in great shape. It seems to be rather chewed up. But there's a special subspecialty called papyrology that allows people to make the most of this kind of work. Again, here's the question of reconstruction. When you can see whole letters, words missing, how much reconstruction are you allowed to do? It's one of the kind of fascinating things in this funny kind of scholarly Scrabble game that people do in papyrology. And here's another kind of funny example. You see here an odd-shaped manuscript. This is, again, actually going back to the 3rd century BC. So this allows us to see how Greek was written at the time. Mostly capital letters with no punctuation, which is not helpful. But the reason why it's cut funny is it was part of a mummy wrapping. That is to say, someone didn't need this text anymore, and it became part of the papier-mâché cartonnage, as they call it, in the wrapping of a mummy. And that's how it was recovered. That gives you some idea of how mere luck often is a part of this process, and why it's so important that people go about the sort of disassembly of things so carefully. And this recovery of texts of Menander is one of those great 20th century stories of recovery. It has allowed us to really see one of the great masterpieces, or rather one of the great writers of later Greek comedy. Now, let's move on. We've talked about archaeology, we've talked about philology, let's talk about history. I don't want to say a lot about this other than to say that the very idea of history comes to us from the ancient world. And what does history mean? Obviously, many cultures tell stories about the past, and that they are important to them. But one of the things that's kind of unique about the Greco-Roman view of this is the idea that history is an inquiry. And this is something that the great historians of the ancient world, like Herodotus or Thucydides, have really kind of bequeathed to the field of history. And for that reason, these are historians that have a kind of privileged status. There are ways in which you can read them, obviously, critically. It's certainly not to say that they are, masters by modern standards of technique. But again, the very notion that we should be investigating the past instead of simply taking received truths, this is a part of the ancient world. In the development of the field of history, again, you have to understand that a lot of the kind of key developments in the 19th century of what we think of as history were developed initially for classical history. And so some of the great historians that one thinks of were largely writing histories of the classical world because of this investment and fascination in it. Edward Gibbon, for example, you may have heard of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, a sort of classic 18th century text. B.G. Niebuhr in Germany used that critical philological method to say, hey, we can look at written sources now with a critical eye. We can try and get behind them and see that there are stories told that are obviously trying to cover over certain truths. George Grote was kind of a political radical in England and wrote a very influential sort of history of Greece in Victorian times. Theodor Mommsen, who pioneered in Germany the idea that history is really about pulling together massive archives of information. That sort of archival approach today, the source critical sort of approach, this is a very important thing in historiography to this day. And again, was initially something applied to his histories of the Roman Empire. He won, in fact, the Nobel Prize of Literature for his work. Now, one of the things we'll talk about now as we move to sort of talk about reception is what goes on in the writing of history. You might say there are those who continue to want to write stories about ancient culture because they simply find it fascinating, and they're still convinced that they can kind of tell the story of antiquity in its own terms, right? What were the Greeks about in their own terms? What were they really doing? Less concerned with what we want them to do. But again, if you look in the popular market, in any history book of the month club, what you'll find is, books that are about how the Greeks, are the foundation of Western civilization, how Marathon, at the Battle of Marathon, for example, the Greeks saved the West from the East and all this kind of stuff. What you find then is there still is a strong desire to create what we might call cultural genealogies, right? Where we map the culture of Greece and Rome as being a part of our story and as something distinct from others. And so this gets us into kind of the new aspect of the field I'm in, which is reception studies. Cultural reception, that sounds funny, right? I was always afraid, if you study Homer, you're called a Homerist. If you study reception, does that make you a receptionist? I was afraid someone would ask me to make coffee. What cultural reception means is there is a long history of relationship between European and American culture and the Greek and Roman past, and also antiquity more generally. What determines that relationship? Why are we so invested in this? And how is it that we decide, as Shelley said, we are all Greeks? Is that fair to the past? Is that fair to ourselves? And what are the consequences of making these kind of appropriations of ancient culture into our story? That's really what this is about. There are centuries and centuries of this kind of appropriation, and fundamentally behind this is the idea of tradition itself. Every culture, effectively, is dealing with the issue of creating a past for itself, whether it's a narrative of justification, whether it's simply trying to have this received wisdom based on a respect, again, for the idea that, older people know something. There are many ways in which you might kind of see tradition both as a good or a bad thing. But fundamentally, the idea is that tradition is an act. It can be deceptive to think of tradition as an heirloom, right? You have a table that was in your parents' house and now it's in your house. When you look at beliefs, practices, religions, again, national histories, things that are more complex, especially things that are verbal, there are a lot of ways in which you are actively shaping. Every retelling of the story, you might say, is a way in which you are actively participating, reshaping, and structuring your culture through this. And so in that regard, the Greek and Roman world have a kind of interesting long history with the way in which they're deployed. And it's something that really goes back all the way to ancient times. To give you an example, you might know that the Homeric poems are concerned with this great battle between Greeks and Trojans, right? And for Greek identity, the idea that they defeated the Trojans, this is, kind of an interesting and important moment in their mythical past. Well, the Romans, when they came to prominence, came to identify themselves with, in fact, the Trojans. So they appropriated, you might say, this Greek story of the Trojan War to see themselves as the Greeks' other, and yet to write themselves into the Greek story. And so this is something that's kind of fascinating in how they create what we might call a cultural genealogy. Well, similarly, in Europe, there have been times when people have, especially great empires in European history, have identified themselves with the Romans, who were, without question, the most successful imperialists of all time in the ancient world. And yet there have been times when people would rather ally themselves with the smaller Greek city-states, especially the city of Athens. So you'll see there's a certain selectivity in which you choose to claim and remember something and you choose to forget something. Or a great example being this. In the tradition of Western liberal culture, we often look at the radical democracy of 5th century Athens as this great moment of freedom. And yet it was a slaveholding society. Right? Clearly freedom in that regard is really, you're just talking about a particular sector of the society. And it's very easy for people to forget this. Or again, the status of women in the 5th century BC was hardly what we would consider, by our standards, freedom. And yet that word freedom is very often attached there, and there are ways in which it does apply. So that selectivity, again, that desire to claim something in the past as a source and origin, this is precisely what reception studies focuses on. So, it's really a set of questions today. How do we construe and construct the past? We construe the past, again, because there are, texts and artifacts and things out there that make up the sort of archive, right, of the ancient world. And we construe them, take some, and leave some behind. But we also construct or reconstruct in the sense that we often supplement, we, add sort of ideas of our own to this, and this is just part of the general process. So one of the questions is, if you look in the long view of this, what is the kind of horizon of expectation, as it's technically called, that influences how the past is construed in the present? So in the 18th century, for example, when you have with the Enlightenment an interest in natural reason and a kind of a beginning of a certain antipathy or rejection of revealed religion, the Greeks become sort of heroes of natural reason. We suddenly see the Greeks identified as more natural, in a sense, or closer to nature. And so suddenly they become part of this new horizon of the relationship between humanity and nature. So that becomes why they're valorized, all right? Now, an obvious and scary question is, how does the past play into modern ideologies? Mussolini, for example, was very fond of bringing up the idea of the Roman Empire during his fascist regime, because he thought this would be a great way, again, to unify a kind of nationalist project around the idea of reclaiming an ancient glory, right? And fascism made a great use of the ancient Roman symbol of the fasces, which is a sort of bundle, which you'll find also used in America, that represents popular sovereignty. But more importantly to me is to move to an opposite direction and say, how does the ancient world challenge modern ideologies? One of the reasons why people have often had an investment in the ancient world is precisely because it allows them to get outside of their particular historical moment. And as we do, for example, the history of what we might call, gay history, for example. The well-known fact that in the Greek world, sexual relationships between men were received, let's just say, differently than they would be today. Or not so much today, but I mean in the past, in reference to what the Christian Church or what Jewish Scripture says about homosexual relations. Okay, this is not to say that in the Greek world they had a gay culture, but what that means is this is very important for those gay people in the past who see here is a valorization of something, or the valuing of something, that a relationship between men could be valid, could have a basis that isn't just simply some sort of bestial sexual act, but actually a spiritual basis even. And by reading Plato or other works like that, they could come to find a certain validation. Well, there's a way in which texts from antiquity actually challenge modern ideologies. And so there's a good example of one that I think is very poignant today, of how it's not simply that ancient texts are part of a tradition that you have to think of as oppressive or ideologically kind of imposing, but one that actually can be challenging. And we'll see in a little bit how, again, the idea of Greek religion and nature kind of speaks to that. Behind this is a question that all people who study culture ask, and that is, can there be truly an objective study of culture? Not just another culture, but even your own. Most of us who work in reception studies like the fact that we are constantly dealing with the way in which the construction of culture is a creative act, an act of the imagination, you might say. But I suppose if we were to have a discussion with our other colleagues associated with this course, this would again be one of those questions we come back to. On the one hand, we all know there's a way in which we distort when we think of the past. We are interested for our own reasons. But on the other hand, there are distortions and there are distortions, right? When you see something that's done that is, you think historically unjustified, what do you do with that? Here's a great example. There's been a lot of interest on the part of some, radical feminists in the idea of a prehistorical matriarchy that was taken over by a patriarchy, right? And again, archaeological evidence is used for this, some textual evidence is used for this, and some of us have a problem with it in that while it makes an interesting story, a kind of modern myth, again, the idea of the prehistory of humanity being matriarchal as opposed to patriarchal, at the same time, there are a lot of problems methodologically with how you argue for that. And so I would just say, as much as we all might say, yes, there are these elements of distortion, at the same time, we're also debating, yes, but we do come back to a question of facts and methodologies in the determination of culture, or at least our view of the past. I just want to now just flesh out a little. That's probably a pun if you look at this picture by Degas of these naked children, but flesh out a little some of what I've said with a particular set of texts. This is just to kind of give you some sense of how reception might work. This is a painting of young Spartans, young Greeks exercising, and you can see the boys here are naked, and the girls are naked from the waist up, right? And what I like about this painting is it kind of captures something about the European fascination with the Greek world. It's captured really in something Oscar Wilde once said. He said, to be truly medieval, one should have no body. To be truly modern, one should have no soul. And to be truly Greek, one should have no clothes. The idea that the naked body somehow represents not just humanity and its beauty, but a certain childish kind of naivete. This is one of the things that's heavily invested in the modern relationship with the Greek world. In part because, of course, when you think about it during the Renaissance, so much of what one saw in medieval painting was religious painting where people are fully clothed, and the celebration of the naked body is not something that's sort of going on. So when you see these statues, these magnificent sort of, muscular statues emerging from the earth or, being put in villas, again, you have that sense in which there's always been this kind of powerful challenge of the culture of antiquity to these certain mores about what is appropriate and what is not. And what is awakened with that is this desire, a desire to go back to a relationship to the human body, to nature, etc. And a lot of this really was bodied forth in the Romantic era throughout the 19th and even into the 20th century. So that's probably why I wanted to talk about this. This is one particular vector of reception. Now, I just wanted to say there are, in the 19th century, kind of two different genealogies for what antiquity represents. And to understand that, you need to go back and see this map of the Roman Empire at its height. It included areas like what is Turkey, the Middle East, Egypt, North Africa, that we no longer think of as part of European culture. But most importantly, if you look up here, you'll see along the Rhineland and the Danubian frontier, that was the boundary. And that had interesting consequences. First of all, everyone to the side within the Roman Empire in the West continued to speak a derivative of Latin, that is a Romance language, with the exception here of Britain. And if you look here at a map of Europe around 1800, what you see is something that kind of influences everything I'm about to talk about. Right here you have the great Empire of France, which goes at various times from being a monarchy to a republic, as you may know, in the complicated history of France. And here you have the disunited states of Germany and the huge kingdom of Prussia, and in the 19th century they will unify into modern Germany. What's important is it arises from this a kind of distinct way in which Germans start thinking about the past as opposed to the way the French did. So let's look at this chart. In the 19th century we begin to develop two different kind of genealogies of antiquity. One, on the Latin side, you might say, of the Rhine, is the assumption that there is a kind of chain of transmission from Greece to Rome, which is true. The Romans took an awful lot of their cultural goods, especially when you think of literature, for example, or architecture, from the Greeks. That's why we often say Greco-Roman. We mean really the Roman appropriation of what is Greek. This, as the Roman Empire becomes Christianized, is transmitted into what we call the Latin Middle Ages. Again, in the West, when Latin is the dominant language of the church and of culture generally. Into the Italian Renaissance, which brings back the study of Greek, but always with the powerful influence of Latin throughout. And French neoclassicism in the 17th century, right? So this would represent what we might call the Roman genealogy of culture. But the Germans, as they began more and more to resist the French, began to resist the Romans. That is to say, they begin to attach a lot of fascination with the idea of the Greeks, in part because of their need to reject the French. And this is just one of the many ways in which you can see a kind of emerging German culture grabbing for a past, right? But not grabbing for the past that the rest of Western Europe shared, grabbing for something different, and yet also, in a sense, central. And that becomes a German assumption that the Germans are uniquely related spiritually. They have this kind of interesting affinity with the Greeks. And there will even be some racial theories that try to claim that they are more racially connected to the Greeks than to the Romans. Now, one important figure in this, in the 18th century, is a man who was fundamental to the development of both archaeology and art history, a man by the name of Winckelmann. And his history of the art of antiquity is one of the great founding classics of the field. A lot of museums in modern times were built around his principles of organization. But it's interesting to just read two little quotes from this history. First of all, he said something that became kind of a bumper sticker for this view of culture for the Greeks, that they had a certain noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, right? That there's a certain serenity and grandeur to Greek culture. Now, when you think of that, it makes sense. Why? Because when you look in your mind, your image of what Greek culture would be, you think of a statue, right? A marble statue. You have that sort of statuesque, quiet, and that sort of oversized human power. And yet, of course, when you really think about it, like Greek tragedy, for example, or the tremendous obscenities of Greek comedy, if you know anything about ancient culture, you realize, wow, that is so wrong, right? But it shows you a particular way in which the culture of ancient Greece becomes aestheticized, right? It's at the same time that the study of aesthetics became so powerful in the West, which is a particular area of philosophical study. And one of the ways in which Greek culture was put on a certain pedestal was precisely as aesthetic objects, right? As models of aesthetic perfection, especially models of how one represents nature. So again, we have nature and aesthetics being what puts the Greeks to the fore. So the citation that he says here, the only way for us to become great or even inimitable, if possible, is to imitate the Greeks. This shows you a certain striving culturally for modern culture. You must imitate the Greeks, both in what they do, but also in their originality, which means you must both imitate and deviate. Okay? And that is a certain kind of poetics of emulation that will be fundamental in many ways to the attitude towards ancient culture. Now, one of the other things that begins to change at the beginning of the 19th century is the educational system. As you may know, especially in Catholic countries, education had often been the business of the church. But gradually in the 19th century, we begin to develop the ideas of secular education. And again, classical education becomes very important in this regard. In Germany, they set up an 8-year classical school known as the Gymnasium, which becomes the way in which you are educated if you're to go on to university. And this becomes something that all educated people who go on to university and then to the medical faculty or the law faculty or whatever, all have in common. Now, here's a quote that is a little chewy but very interesting from the philosopher Hegel. And the reason why it's here is I want you to kind of listen to the terms he uses to describe ancient culture in education. In a way, the idea is that young boys, again, this was mostly for boys, will spend a great deal of time with Greek and Roman culture in the schools because they are recapitulating almost the childhood of Western culture, right? They're going to re-experience this as in modern times as young boys, and then they can grow on and acquire the rest of European culture. He says here, the perfection and glory of those, that is Greek and Roman masterpieces, and here he's talking about the literature especially, which is part of the school curriculum, which they read in the original Greek and Latin, must be the spiritual bath, the secular baptism that first and indelibly attunes and tinctures the soul in respect of taste and knowledge. Notice that idea of secular baptism. Classical education provides a way to deviate from this tradition of religious education. A way in which the modern state, especially, and you think of a more centralized system like that was emerging in Prussia and later Germany, this allows for there to be a centering through classical culture of the various people who come in, who might be Lutheran, they might be Catholic, and in fact they might be Jewish. To go back to our comparison, Sigmund Freud went to a classical high school in Vienna, which by the time he graduated had a majority of Jewish students. So one way in which these newly emancipated Jews were able to become acculturated was through their classical education. Everyone had separate religious education of a sort with a licensed member of the, either the church or the Jewish community. But what they had in common was the classical past. So there's a way in which secular modernity, you might say, latches onto classical antiquity as a way of avoiding some of the denominational conflicts that had made the previous history of Europe so difficult. To continue with the Hegel quote, for this initiation, a general perfunctory acquaintance with the ancients is not sufficient. He's trying to justify why you have to have 8 years of Latin and Greek. We must take up our lodging with them, so that we can breathe their air, absorb their representations, their customs, one might even say their errors and prejudices, and become at home in this world the most beautiful that has ever been. That's an extraordinary statement. You need to acquire Greek prejudices. In other words, there's a process of kind of alienation almost, that one must go fully into this world for a number of years. But you'll notice, he calls it the most beautiful that has ever been. It is still an aesthetic world, right? It's still something that appeals very much to the European imagination, that somehow this is a beautiful world for children to be in. While the first paradise was that of human nature, here he's talking about, primitive times, this is the second, the higher paradise of the human spirit, which emerges like a bride from her chamber endowed with a yet more beautiful naturalness, with freedom, depth, and serenity. So here's an interesting problem. In what way is the ancient world primitive, right? When they look at the Greeks and the Romans, they say they're obviously civilized. These are not people who live, in a simple primitive economy or a primitive culture. These are complex civilizations. But on the other hand, they want them to be somewhat more natural and serene than modern times, in which are confusing, in which society is very fragmented. So what we have here is the idea of a paradise of the human spirit. While they're not living in total sort of naive communion with nature, they are living, in a sense, with a kind of first and youthful experience of human culture. The first wild glory of its dawn in the east is restrained by the grandeur of form and tames into beauty. The human spirit no longer here manifests its profundity in confusion, gloom, or arrogance, but in perfect clarity. There you see an important division between East and West. That although there where Greek and Roman civilizations are very recent compared with those of Egypt or the ancient Near East, the Mesopotamian cultures, somehow what happens in Greece is a certain type of perfection. And here again we get into a very problematic area. The way in which Western culture will focus on Greece as its beginning and not on Mesopotamian culture or ancient Egyptian culture, again, even though we know that the Greeks did develop and did receive a great deal from those cultures, including the Greek alphabet. So, when we were looking then at that quote by Hegel, what you see is an investment in the educational system that tells you what the modern person must do is to be ancient as a child. That is to say, to go through this experience of the ancient world, in a sense to develop one's taste and a certain kind of nuanced and interesting view of the world that is set apart from, effectively, the way the rest of modernity is going to go for them. It's an interesting idea, but as I said, it is one that creates a new educational ideal and system that allows educated people to have this in common. And it existed really up until the First World War for people really across Europe. Less so in the United States, but still, you know, this educational ideal was very effective, even in this country. Now, I've put in some poems to end with, and I just want to read a few selections of this. I think this reading will be given to you, so you can obviously read and discuss this at greater length. But the reason why these poems I thought would be helpful and interesting is because they show a certain element of fascination with the ancient world. These are poets. They are what we would consider romantic poets. In that sense, you'll have to forgive the diction. It's a little precious. The translations from the German are deliberately couched in terms that will sound like English romantic poetry. But I chose those translations to give you a feeling for this as being a particular moment, maybe not our moment, but a particular moment of fascination with antiquity. The first, The Gods of Greece, is a very famous poem by Friedrich Schiller, whom you might know as the fellow who penned the words to the Ode to Joy, made famous by Beethoven. And what's interesting here is a Christian German looking back on the religion of ancient Greece in a way that shows a certain nostalgia for what is really a relationship with nature. When you think about it, you know, Christianity had centuries of making fun of ancient paganism. You know, they had this complicated pantheon of gods who misbehaved very badly. They were highly anthropomorphic, meaning they were all too human in what they did, especially the god Zeus, who was constantly raping mortal maidens. You would think this is not something one would be nostalgic for. In fact, in the centuries of Christian tradition, the assumption is the coming of, you know, the Christian revelation spared people this terrible religion, right? But in the 19th century, what you see is a return to admiration for the humanity of Greek religion, and especially in this poem, a certain relationship to nature. So what we have here are just the first two stanzas, and I'm going to read them and kind of gloss as I go along or comment on them. Again, the diction is a little precious because it's romantic poetry. Ye in the age gone by who ruled the world, a world how lovely then, and guided still the steps of happy men in the light leading strings of careless joy. He's referring to the ancient gods here. How lovely then. Obviously there's a sense in which the world in modern times is less lovely, right? And that there was a time which was a time of careless joy. You'll notice, it sort of sounds like someone talking about childhood, right? A time before one is wrapped up in true, you know, worldly responsibilities and concerns. Ah, flourish then your service of delight, how different, oh, how different in the day when thy sweet fanes with many a wreath were bright, O Venus Amethusia. Fanes means temples, and he's specifically referencing the goddess of love. There's probably no other god that would be different from the Christian notion of deity than the goddess of love. Again, a power that sort of, you know, represents sexual pleasure, divorced really from any particular responsibility or marital union, in fact. This is one of the things that's interesting about the goddess Venus. There's an awareness of the power of love and sexual desire without necessarily saying it has to be harbored within some sort of sacred, you know, family obligation. Then through a veil of dreams woven by song, truth's youthful beauty glowed, and life's redundant and rejoicing streams gave to the soulless soul. Very important idea. Truth's youthful beauty glowed. Again, the idea that somehow it was more natural and truer in those days, before modernity made things complex and false. Also the idea that the world was full of life, and humans gave to the soulless soul, meaning they saw in natural processes like the movement of the ocean or storms or thunder, they gave it a soul. That is to say, they thought these were the operations of living gods. Wherever they flowed, man gifted nature with divinity. In other words, nature was then divinity. To lift and link her to the breast of love. All things betrayed to the initiate eye the track of gods above. Now you have to realize that one of the consequences of Christian civilization is the idea that God is beyond nature, not in nature. That is to say that he is the creator and this is the creation, and while God might be sort of seen through the intelligent design of the universe, the fact of the matter is one does not worship nature. This is a big no-no, right, in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But in the ancient world, the sea was Poseidon, right? The fire was Hephaestus. So what he's sort of feeling a nostalgia for was a sense that one could revere nature directly. So here we see this modern yearning for nature mapped onto the world of the ancient Greeks, and especially these gods. Now, skipping ahead, let me just read a few other stanzas that show you how he's criticizing modernity from the standpoint of desiring antiquity, right? Not to that culture gay, stern self-denial or sharp penance wan, well might each heart be happy in that day. Self-denial, right? Sharp penance. These sound like Christian sort of spiritual ideals. In other words, one was more at home with oneself. For gods, the happy ones were kin to man. In other words, they were anthropomorphic. They were like us, unlike the transcendent God that we now worship. The beautiful alone, the holy there. So again, you'll notice this aesthetic charge. Things were beautiful, and that was all you needed for holiness. No pleasure shamed the gods of that young race. So again, the gods were sexual. They had no shame in the fact that they were so. Things that the Greek gods do by the standard, again, of Christian religion are quite scandalous. So that the chaste Chamaeni, and that's just meaning the muses, favoring were, and the subduing grace. So again, the idea is that because of this sort of comfortableness with the human form, the natural sort of affinity with the powers of the natural world, the lack of shame for pleasure, this was an ideal aesthetic situation. This is why ancient culture was so, successful. A palace, every shrine, your sports heroic, yours the crown of contests hallowed to a power divine. The ancient Greeks especially had a powerful sense that competition was sacred. This is how you honored a god. And again, this is a very un-Christian notion. Normally we think competition is vainglorious, but the Olympic Games or the great festivals of Athens, these were competitions. As rushed the chariots thundering to renown, fair round the altar where the incense breathed, moved your melodious dance inspired, and fair above victorious brows the garland wreathed, sweet leaves round odorous hair, etc., etc. So again, he's trying to think about the ancient festivals of sports competitions, of drama competitions, as a moment of sort of profound and positive celebration and aesthetic joy. Okay. Let's just look at how that ends. Actually, these aren't the last stanzas, but this is basically enough to make the point, right? He says, "Art thou, fair world, no more? Return, thou virgin bloom on nature's face." So, the ancient world is the virgin bloom on nature's face. This was when culture was more natural, right? A sense that we were more human, more wholly human in this ancient time. Only on the minstrel's magic shore can we the footstep of sweet fable trace. Again, only in poetry can we get anywhere close to this, right? The meadows mourn for the old hallowing life, vainly we search the earth of gods bereft. So the world now is empty. This is a kind of idea of modernity that is a disenchantment of the world, right? Where once the warm and living shapes were rife, shadows alone were left. Cold from the north has gone over the flowers that the blast that killed their May. Cold from the north. What is he talking about? Northern European culture, as opposed to the Mediterranean culture of the ancient world? And to have reached the worship of the one, a universe of gods must pass away. So again, he's clearly talking about the passage to Christianity that European culture underwent, and how this swept away the world of the gods. Morning I search on yonder starry steeps, but thee no more, Selene, there I see. Selene is the goddess of the moon, so what he sees now is just the moon, in other words. He does not see the goddess. And through the woods I call, and o'er the deeps, an echo answers me. That's kind of an interesting idea because clearly when you think of an echo, you think that there is nothing there, it's empty. But in the ancient world, Echo is part of a myth that she is a maiden who is doomed to kind of repeat what you say. All right? So, what you see in the Schiller poem, then, is a profound sense of yearning for an ancient world, which is really a yearning for a relationship with nature, for a moment when culture was, in a certain sense, better, more humanely kind of connected, both to human nature and to nature generally. And we inhabited a world that was alive, right? So modernity then is experienced as this sort of dislocation and you might almost say exile from nature. That's a sort of classic way in which then in the 19th century there's a romantic attitude, a nostalgia for the world of the Greeks. I just want to look briefly at two more examples. I know we're running a little long, but this again is just to kind of show you what in reception study we're often fascinated in. How people who are modern are taking the culture of the ancient world in some sense and doing something with it. There's a short poem about the ancient god and hero Prometheus by the German poet Goethe, which is rather different from the poem of Schiller. The two of them knew each other, they were great friends and contemporaries. But the reason why I find this interesting is it helps you to understand how whenever we talk about reception, you have to look very carefully at detailed examples, right? Because the vectors of reception are not only different between different people, but actually for the same people. They might make, one thing out of antiquity one day and another thing another day. Now, this poem is written in the persona of Prometheus, who is a god often thought to be the great helper of mankind. There are various versions of myths always, but in some myths Prometheus created mankind. In some myths he gave fire to mankind. The gods wanted to keep it a secret and he stole it, hid it in a fennel stalk, and then gave it to humanity. So what this is the idea that Prometheus is being punished for what he's done for human beings, and he is defiant against the gods. So here what you get is a defiant spirit striking out against the gods. What is being captured in this poem? Obviously, it's a kind of persona or a mask. Is it a defiance against, the god of tradition? You don't want to say, the Christian god, therefore you say Zeus. Is it a defiance against authority? Whatever is being defied, it's clear that it is a celebration of humanity in its suffering, sort of long-suffering spirit. So he says, cover thy spacious heavens, Zeus, with clouds of mist, and like the boy who lops the thistles' heads, disport with oaks and mountain peaks, yet thou must leave my earth still standing. In other words, Zeus, who throws thunder down from Olympus, can only strike the things that are high. The earth itself, the place we inhabit, will still be there. My cottage too, which was not raised by thee, leave me my hearth, whose kindly glow by thee is envied. Right? So this life, the small life that we have, is envied by the gods. Right? Now he says something contemptuous. I know not poorer under the sun than ye gods, ye nourish painfully with sacrifices and votive prayers your majesty. Right? He's sort of ridiculing the gods for being needy. They need to be worshipped, right? And to this, he will contrast his own self-assertion, right? His own independence. You would even starve if children and beggars were not trusting fools, which is a terrible thing to say about religious people, right? But in the context of this, being displaced into this sort of ancient pagan setting, obviously it doesn't give offense. Didst thou e'er fancy that life I should learn to hate, and fly to deserts because not all my blossoming dreams grew ripe? Here's the spirit of defiance, right? You cannot make me stop my striving and my enjoyment of life. Here sit I, this is the conclusion, forming mortals after my image, a race resembling me to suffer, to weep, to enjoy, to be glad, and thee to scorn as I. This is a great sort of celebration of the human spirit, in a sense. And again, this goes back to the idea that fundamental to European humanism is this connection with the ancient world. You need to understand that the attitude that is in this poem in the ancient world would have been seen as a kind of impious attitude, a dangerous attitude. But again, this is one of the interesting ways in which antiquity can be used to kind of triangulate certain feelings and certain ideas. And this kind of rebellious, humanistic stand against authority is precisely what's in the poem. Very different, again, from the Schiller poem with its nostalgia and the sense that all this is lost. It wants to thrust us back into a moment in antiquity, to speak the language of antiquity, in other words, to express a kind of rebellion. Let's end with a very famous English poem by John Keats, The Ode on a Grecian Urn. And the reason why, again, I want to end with this is for you to think simply of the way in which the ancient world remains a kind of object of fascination. This is a poem very much fascinated or focused on A particular type of pot painting, which might be like this here. You see the satyrs and maenads cavorting, right? This sense in which these artifacts have a fixity, right? And a kind of purity that we in life do not get to have, right? So while they are, in a sense, fragmentary, they are also eternal. This is the sort of paradox about the idea of the past. A certain fascination with that idea. Let's just start with this stanza. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter, therefore you soft pipes play on. Unheard melodies. He's toying with the idea that this is a silent image, right? And yet there's a sweetness to them. Remember I told you archaeology often has this problematic relationship with Reconstruction. Whenever we look at an artifact, obviously we are reading into it. And so this is a sort of celebration of that fact, that there's a sweetness to unheard melodies because we are reading the scene, right? We are inferring this, projecting onto it. Not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss, forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. In other words, they will never consummate, right, this kind of pursuit that's going on, and yet they will be forever those beautiful forms, okay? It's kind of an interesting idea in which they are suspended forever in that moment. Just reflect again on that, in that quote by Hegel, about the idea that one goes back to antiquity and needs to sort of absorb it in that beautiful kind of moment. Here's the conclusion. Attic shape. It's a reference to the pot which is from Attica, the region of Greece where Athens is. Fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought. Of marble men, obviously he's kind of connecting the idea of these forms with the idea of statues, right? With forest branches and the trodden weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity. Cold pastoral. So, again, the stimulation here of this ancient artifact is something akin to a sense of eternity, of timelessness, right? Cold pastoral, though, is an interesting thing to call it. It's pastoral because, again, it's a scene, a sort of natural scene where they're cavorting about, and yet it's cold in the sense that it is, remote. Or even dead. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain amidst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye need on earth, all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. Beauty is truth, and truth beauty. Again, this absolutely interesting fascination with the idea of beauty and the truth of nature, of human nature, and those things, those essential truths to which one holds on to. The reason why I wanted to end with that is, first of all, it's a very famous moment, you might say, of reception. Literally, a poet sort of responding to an artifact, so this kind of encapsulates, if you will, what reception is all about. But also, I think that perennial issue of the past. We want, in a sense, to return to the past, to recreate it in our minds as a sort of image, as a sort of scenario, as perhaps even a drama. And this, I think, is a very interesting fact about culture. Unlike personal memories, cultural memories, if you will, that we acquire in this way, are things that we share and things that bear a kind of complicated relationship to tradition. And yet we're doing it. We're doing it all the time. And for that reason, then, let's just conclude with the thought that ancient studies, although in a way you could say, it always seems like a kind of cultural necrophilia, is still a very vital part of what we think of when we study culture in the broader interests of humanity.